we go. So, yeah, thank you for having me again. I think it's time that I started doing things for ASSAP again, and giving a few talks and updates as to what we're doing at the University of Northampton and what I'm doing at other places. I guest lecture at Manchester Metropolitan University as well. It was good to see the post online, apart from small skirmishes of people that clearly still have some sort of disgruntlement with me that don't want me to give talks, but 70 have turned up. So there's some people interested in what I've got to say. So thank you for being here. So the topic today is going to be after-death communication experiences, and it's really only going to be a concise overview. There is a lot. We could turn this into 10 classes. On the basis of this, really, and it's got beautiful overlaps between parapsychology and thanatology. So parapsychology is the science of human experiences and abilities that appear to be outside of the realms of conventional scientific understanding. We'd be interested in extrasensory perception, telepathy, clairvoyance, and precognition. We're looking at mind-to-mind interaction, seeing information at distance and information before it happens, before it comes about. We'd also be interested in PK, psychokinesis, manipulation of people or systems, biological systems with the mind alone. The classic cases there, people think of Uri Geller and spoon bending, but there's also been studies on trying to manipulate pond life and their swimming patterns or stopping frog hearts. Nina Palagina was famous for that. Studies that they've done there, and then it translated into films such as The Men Who Stared at Goats, where you see the soldiers trying to stop goats' hearts with their mind. And there's also that classic tagline, if you believe in psychokinesis, I can see you all right now on your own camera screens. If you believe in psychokinesis, can you raise my hand? I think some of you raised your own hand there instead of mine. Classic line, awful, dad joke. And then survival. Survival is the third strand for parapsychology. We'd be interested in anything that suggests survival of the mind, consciousness, awareness outside of the body, out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences, through to beyond permanent bodily death. So mediumship, mediums claiming they have a message from departed loved ones, apparitions of the dead, poltergeist-type phenomena, reincarnation, electronic voice phenomena, and many other things besides. So we're going to focus primarily on experiences where someone has had an experience of someone after that person's death, and there's some sort of communication going on. Most people might think of this typically in terms of bereavement, but it's not always the case. You could have an after-death communication involving seeing someone you don't recognize, and in doing a bit of research on that apparition, it turns out that person had recently died around that point that you'd seen them. But most typically, it's someone that you know fairly close to the time in which they passed away. There are cases in which it happened decades afterwards. You can see there, exceptional experiences and consciousness studies, EECS, that's our research group at the University of Northampton. Within the psychology division, where we have 40 staff members strong within psychology, one of our three research specialism groups is this. The other ones focus on things like counselling and child and adolescent mental health. Exceptional experience and consciousness studies, EECS, has a team of psychologists that primarily come from 5 different backgrounds: parapsychology, which I've just defined, transpersonal psychology, so people interested in religious and peak experiences, that has a nice overlap to parapsychology, consciousness studies, cognitive psychology, and neuroscience. So all 5 of those strands are encapsulated within EECS and what we do there. And we've got all kinds of projects on the go. Even myself, I have 8 PhD students under me doing a variety of topics, from looking at psychic functioning and diet, veganism, vegetarianism and fasting, psi and flotation tanks, a couple of projects on the after-death communications, one on near-death experiences, one on early spiritualist photography and trying to replicate that in modern day from more so a photographic point of view, and many other projects besides. So we can come back to that in question and answer. Again, because it's been so long since I spoke to ASSAP, there's probably a lot of you that aren't familiar with who I am, except for via social media. So I've been based at the University of Northampton technically since 2007. So I've been there for a very long time, from undergraduate status, going away for a bit, returned for my PhD, and then took on a lectureship role that grew and grew and grew. So now I'm associate professor after all that time. But I'm not full-time at the university, so if you ever visit, it's unlikely you're going to see my face. It's only on certain days that I make an appearance, and I head back down there. But I spend a lot of my time away from that doing different programs, different shows, radio and TV. One of our attendees here tonight is Helen Blaby. During COVID and lockdown, we did a show called Science Detectives for the BBC, which is on iTunes. There was some overlap within that to parapsychology, but we looked at the science of all kinds of things, interviewing different people. I primarily spent my time in the media, though, being there as a voice for skepticism for parapsychology and psychology, and done things such as ITV's This Morning, and more recently Paranormal Captured, which is kind of like a goggle box for the paranormal, where you've got some hobbyist ghost hunters watching clips that seem unusual, through to two specialists, a behavioral expert, and then myself, from the viewpoint of parapsychology, looking at these clips and human interaction with allegedly haunted locations, doing an investigation of sorts, and we comment on what we're seeing. So that went on PIC TV, and I've done various other things as well regarding haunting type phenomena. I end up on programs like that. So down there you can see me and Nick Knowles doing a program that was based on The Cage in Essex. So I mentioned parapsychology a few times, and that's just a snapshot there of just a few places. There's about a dozen UK universities that have a taught module, typically within a psychology degree, for parapsychology, and then another dozen after that where there are staff that have specialism or interest in parapsychology that can take on research degrees. So even though we mentioned possibly the University of Northampton, a lot of people think of Edinburgh because of the Coesler Parapsychology Unit. We had Bob Morris there for a number of years, and he saw 34 PhDs under him in parapsychology. Chris French at Goldsmiths, and then various other ones here. There are many that will support parapsychology and your interests. And if you wanted to go to that level of going through academia and exploring things, either with a taught course or a research degree. Buxton University there at the bottom as well. There you've got Associate Professor Kieran O'Keefe and Dr. Matthew Smith. Oh, I think Matthew Smith is also an Associate Professor now as well. Very familiar names that you may have heard of because of Most Haunted and their time in there. So we can talk about that later when it comes to education in parapsychology. But the after-death communication experiences actually have a really long history, even though more recently medical science has become interested in them, and certainly studies of human well-being. You can go all the way back to the foundings of psychical research in terms of the Society for Psychical Research, really encapsulating all of these comments, experiences of the spiritualist movement, and finally forming together a team of academics that are interested in, okay, why are so many people now reporting in the media experiences of hauntings, ghosts, mediumship? What's actually going on here? Indeed, we even had the Ghost Club founded around the 1860s, but the SPR was a group of philosophers and psychologists and physicists that really wanted to figure out, do we already have the answers? And actually those answers show us why people think they're having an unusual experience, or is there something new to learn? And we need to understand both of those sides. We need to really have a good system here of filtering the wheat from the chaff. And the American branch was founded a couple of years later, around 1884, 85, that was trying to act against the British SPR and saying, no, we do have all the answers and we'll show you. But within their first 10 years or so of being founded, they realized that they were quite on par with the British SPR in that there were a number of cases of mediums whereby they couldn't figure out how things were actually occurring. They didn't seem to fit conventional explanations. But this was the first major masterpiece of the British SPR, Phantasms of the Living, produced as a 2-volume piece, which was a large collection of a variety of postal correspondence and other material of people having unusual experiences spontaneously, many of them surrounding death. But they also had a collection of cases as well that were surrounding apparitions of living individuals as well, hence the title, that it's, you know, it can be just as common to experience apparitions of living individuals as it can be of the deceased. But this was the first major survey, and they were starting to initiate their journal and their proceedings, which are still going to this day. And that's where, within the proceedings particularly, more advances in their survey experiments were going forward. So from that book, that 2-volume book, Frederick Myers, who's on the left, and Edmund Gurney, who's on the right, those are the way the original photographs were. I've not put them the other way around, otherwise it looks like they've had an argument. So Gurney is on the right, Myers is on the left. They took cases out of Phantasms of the Living and started to analyse them. So in volume 5 of the proceedings, this was one of the first major papers that got my interest when I started to look into this. And it's entitled On Apparitions Occurring Soon After Death. And in this, they took 231 cases of hallucinations of the dead, in which 28 occurred within 1 week of the death of the individual visualized. Many accounts were not revisited, were revisited from Phantasms of the Living, where 134 cases of post-mortem apparitions were analysed. In 104 cases, it was not known whether the recipient's cases preceded or followed the experienced death. And that's mainly because some of these people weren't available for interview. They could have been postal correspondents and they heard nothing back, or the person had passed away in the interim or become uncontactable. So all the data they had written down was all the data they had written down. When they wanted some of those specifics, they just weren't available. In 40 cases, the experience of apparitions occurred within a 24-hour period. Now, 12 hours before the death and 12 hours afterwards has become famously known as the crisis period, in which someone is about to go through a particular crisis, heart attack, serious injury, something like that, and someone else, a very close friend or family member, has a dream, a vision, a distinct sense, something regarding that individual. Could even be a distinct vision of that person clutching their chest and falling over, something like that, but waking up in the middle of the night, noting the time, and Uncle Bob, who has passed away, who emigrated to Australia, did indeed die at that particular time. You learn through a telegram that's sent or a phone call, something like that. And this is from just a simple pencil diagram that they did, an example that within 1 week of someone dying, people start to have unusual experiences, but certainly within that 24-hour period we talked about, that absolute peak, that moment of death, people have all kinds of unusual experiences, particularly regarding deathbed phenomena, which has become very famous. Some of you may have had your own experiences with that. And if you have, I could recommend books such as Sir William Barrett's Deathbed Visions, which first came out in 1926. It was his wife, who was a senior doctor of gynecology, who got him interested in that because she'd had patients that had these visions. And so he turned to some of these accounts and he did a very thorough job of investigating these claims of deathbed visions, passed away during the writing of it. So his wife finished off the book and it's now been reprinted a few times. One of them was part of the Colin Wilson collection, and Colin Wilson provided an introduction to the book. And more recently, White Crow Books has reprinted it. You could also look at Camille Flammarion's Death and Its Mystery, Before Death, At the Moment of Death and After Death. Elenda Haraldson and Carlos Osis, At the Hour of Death. And then most recently, The Art of Dying by Peter Fenwick and Elizabeth Fenwick. So the moment of death has been notoriously a situation in which many people have had experiences, from hospices to care homes, in which when they know someone is dying, they may classically leave a door open or a window open. There's very much this symbolic sign that it's letting the soul, that personality, the individual, the consciousness leave the body and leave the room, go back out into the earth. And then after that point, there seems to be a slope, a decline in people reporting these kinds of experiences that seems to disperse after a year, but we have record of a couple of years on, decade on, and a few people still do report experiences, but it's more likely that within the first year of loss, people are going to report these experiences. The next major survey that came out, that by far today is still one of the biggest ones, has been looked into many times. Even Becky Smith, I'm not sure if Becky's here today, her PhD was based on this and doing a more modern day replication in the 21st century on looking at this. But this was in volume 10 of the Proceedings of the Society of Psychical Research. Their main question that they asked in sending out the survey, and incredible at the time, I mean, that they started to initiate this survey in the 1880s, and they'd actually sent out to members of the SPR some trial surveys as well to see if they thought the questions were appropriate or not. And so by the early 1890s, it started to go out to 17,000 individuals via postal correspondence. Main question being, have you ever had a vivid impression of seeing or being touched or hearing voices, which impression, so far as you could discover, was not due to any external cause? And from the analysis over 17,000 return questionnaires, 10% reported types of hallucinations which could be seen as within that bereavement period. I would read it specifically, but the toolbar again blocked it. Let's get rid of this. I floated it. Yeah, consider post-mortem encounters. I'm getting so many benefits of being a moderator. So we have to skip forward a long way. So that was in the 1890s that survey came out. The SPR continued, the ASPR continued, a sub-branch of the ASPR appeared in the 1920s called the BSPR, the Boston Society for Psychic Research. The Rhine Revolution happened. That's where at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, Joseph Banks Rhine and his wife Louisa Rhine started to put parapsychological phenomena formally into the lab and using controls to demonstrate that actually these experiences seem to be the possibility of the masses, not just a select few, people claiming that they're psychic or having spontaneous experiences. We can control for ESP and PK and put it in the lab. Maybe that also holds the answer to the extended mind and survival beyond death. But it wasn't until much later on you have a general practitioner, a young general practitioner called William Dewi Rees, based in Wales, North Wales, and he had become fascinated with conducting research. He was really interested in collecting data and making new discoveries, and he was primarily looking at research regarding death and rural tractor fatalities and things like that, and some of the negative attributes of bereavement. And he decided, because he was getting involved in conferences and attending, he found he wasn't really being taken so seriously as a general practitioner with obviously the title of doctor, doing research papers, because that was his only qualification. And most people that he would find at conferences doing research were PhDs, or they held an MD or an EdD or various other types of doctorates that showed that they'd actually done research and carried out a thesis that was then defended. And so he decided to return to King's College London and take on an MD thesis by research through the School of Medicine and under the banner of psychiatry. Medicine didn't quite see it as formal medicine in the way that he'd been trained, so they put it under the banner of psychiatry. And he was looking at the negative attributes of bereavement, and he interviewed 293 widows and widowers about their experiences. But towards the end of interviewing, he found that some of them came forward and said, yeah, after they passed away, I still felt their presence around me. And so he decided to go back and re-interview all of them, specifically asking about this. And he found that over 50% of them reported in the affirmative that they'd had experiences of sensing the presence of a deceased loved one all the way through to seeing their apparition. He completed his thesis in 1971, successfully defended it, and in the same year wrote up a summary paper that's no more than 3 or 4 pages for the British Medical Journal, called The Hallucinations of Widowhood, that when we talk about this topic of after-death communications and people write about it, this is now a very highly cited paper, because it's the foundation of things making a jump from psychical research, and unfortunately, the wider areas of science and medical science are not really dipping into the journal of the SPR or its proceedings, the American branch, and taking notice of the fact that this research is not new at all. Some very well-educated medical doctors, physicists, psychologists, philosophers had already done the groundwork. But it's because it's picked up by this general practitioner, a paper on this very topic goes into the British Medical Journal, people start to take note. No longer are we seeing the banner of paranormal or parapsychology. It's under the banner of medicine. And William Dewi Rees paid due respect to psychical research. All of his original writings for that thesis cited SPR material and what had been done, especially the senses of hallucinations. And so that really kickstarted things and started to make people take note of things as well. I knew Dewi several years before he passed away, because while I was writing my first PhD, I corresponded with him. He hated emails. That was very similar to another person I knew called John Randall. So we sent a lot of letters back and forth. And because of that, I photocopied them. And now I have a beautiful folder of our writings back and forth, which I know I'll return to at some point because it's really useful. As moderator, because people keep coming in, I can hide this floating toolbar. There we go. And so one of the main questions that he asked people out of interest was, how did the experiences influence bereavement? How did it help you at all, or did you find it harmful? What did you make of the experience? The vast majority of people found these experiences to be helpful in the process of bereavement. A few people found them harmful because initially they were shocking or scary. Typically, in those instances, they tend to reflect on those experiences and find them positive later on. And a few people initially weren't sure what to make of it. If you're interested in knowing a little bit more about Dewi, I did write his obituary that appeared in the JSPR in volume 83, so you can turn to that. Just progress to the next slide. Let me know. There we go. You can also learn more about Dewi's life. He did write an autobiography called General Practice as It Was. And in a lot of his writings, he always brings up the fact that he'd done that paper for the British Medical Journal, but one that's pretty much focused on the ADCs, the after-death communications, is one of his nearer final books, Pointers to Eternity. So if you look at that, you can see what he did in terms of the progression from his medical doctorate thesis. And then later on, putting adverts out in church newspapers about people having these experiences, and particularly from a Christian perspective, what people made of them. The person to follow after Dewi was in 1980. It was an American actor whose formal training was in theatre studies and drama, but he had a personal experience himself that led him to go back to further education and do a PhD at International College at the time, which he completed in 1980, and he wrote a summary article on what that thesis found in April 1982 for Fate magazine. D. Scott Rogo wrote to Julian and knew of his PhD thesis and more or less begged him to write a summary article. So that's where you get the main details of what he did. There doesn't seem to be much documentation anywhere else. So it's a very good article to find. What he did was he conducted a survey of 206 individuals going to various colleges and mainly targeting the psychology departments and their students. He did know in writing this that I'm afraid a bias still exists which considers it unacceptable to deal at face value with experiences such as seeing ghosts. The patient is trained to deny the experiences or to explain it away as holding on to the loved one. So he found that from their opinions of going to their GP, going to their general practitioner and saying, I'm having these constant dreams of the deceased, or I'm feeling their presence around me. And the GP not knowing of any of the research or data, just saying, well, you know, it's not good, is it? Maybe you should just knock those on the head, put them to one side. They're not very good for you to keep thinking of that person. Little did they know that it turns out by doing some research on this, you can find that there are many benefits to having them. He went back to doing this thesis because it was about 7 months or so after his mother had passed away. He was entertaining guests at his home, and he was specifically cutting up a pineapple in the kitchen and placing it in a bowl, or was asking his wife the whereabouts of a particular bowl, and he felt someone was behind him. So he turned to the right, and as he did, he knew they'd moved out of his field of vision and had gone over to the left. So he moved from the right and looked over to the left, and he saw his mother standing there in the kitchen, and she looked bright, radiant, in good health, but she was wearing a detailed pale blue gown that he'd never seen before. And he exclaimed, "Ma," and then she dissolved. She didn't disappear, he said. Specifically, he wanted it to be clear, she dissolved. So she wasn't just gone in a flash, she just dissolved away. And then he felt this great sigh of relief within himself from having that experience. The next day, he phoned his sister to tell her of the experience that he'd had, and she was upset. And it wasn't because of what he was suggesting, I've seen mother's ghosts, it's because she didn't have the experience. She spent a lot more time with their mother. And he described the pale blue gown that she was wearing in specific detail. That was it for her. The tears dry up, and she said, "That's mother's message to me." Julian asks what it was about, and she said about 2 or 3 weeks before mother passed away, we were on one of our usual shopping trips where we'd look at clothes, and she tried on that particular pale blue detail gown. And she wanted to buy it for herself, but it was about $300-400 or so, and she couldn't dream of parting with that much money for it. But she ummed and ahed, should I treat myself to it or not? And she loved it. She'd spent ages in the front of the mirror considering whether she would buy it or not, and it only made sense to Julian's sister. So that was her message. I was asked if I'd mentioned phone calls from the dead, and it's possibly one of the main topics I've talked on before for ASSAP. Certainly when we're at the University of Bath, I'd spoken on it a few times. And it was my first major book. I wrote a book that follows on from this one here by D. Scott Rogo and Raymond Bayliss, simply called Telephone Calls from the Dead, which is a new analysis of what they did 30 years on, with some of their unanalyzed cases and a load of new cases as well. And that came out in 2012. So it's just over 10 years ago now that came out. Time has flown by. and it really needs revising. I am working on it at the moment to produce a whole new version of Telephone Calls from the Dead with at least another 4 or 5 chapters in it. And more recently, in this last year, Scott Rogo, unfortunately, was murdered in 1990, and I'm writing his biography as we speak. And I had his, with help of going through his autopsy report and other things I looked at, I got involved with the cold case detectives in California, and we finally, case closed. We've had his murder fully solved. So there's an interesting story I have to tell you later on down the line. But these 2 individuals, D. Scott Rogo in the middle there and Raymond Bayless to the right, Scott was more or less Raymond Bayless's student. Raymond Bayless taught him a lot about psychical research. Raymond Bayless for a long time managed the Southern Californian Society for Psychical Research, and Scott became one of the research officers for it. Later, the president was Dr. Elizabeth McAdams, who shifted the whole society into the Life After Life Club, which is still going to this day. But while they're over there, they'd reached out to a number of people asking if they'd had unusual telephone call experiences. The majority of those experiences seem to involve phone calls which are suggestive of a deceased individual getting in touch. But there are unusual ones as well regarding someone making a telephone call, it being received and then verified to be nowhere near a telephone at the time that call took place, yet someone received it and they had their voice and characteristics and knowledge. So it's a really interesting sub-branch of the ADCs and something that I paid particular attention to. In my second PhD that I did at Manchester Metropolitan University, I focused primarily on those types of experiences, the research methods involved, and how good they are in terms of presenting evidence for survival beyond death. So that's a topic to come back to later on in terms of just focusing on that. So after all of this research on after-death communications and a few papers that I put out there and chapters, Professor Chris Rowe, who I believe has given talks to ASSAP many times before, he was at a conference for a research funding group and met Evelyn. And Evelyn had put in a bid to do research on after-death communication. So Chris mentioned my PhD thesis, the fact that we've been working on it for 4 or 5 years to that point and then collected a lot of data. And should we just group together? And this was also in association with the Scientific and Medical Network. So David Lorimer, the director of that, also agreed to come on board. So we became a 4-way team, really. And in those initial funds, we decided to put out a large-scale survey. We'd met Evelyn at her home in Geneva, and we'd spent 3 days solid and many weeks prior on email and video chats discussing this survey and all the questions they asked. I think it was into about 140 questions or more, something like that, in English, Spanish, and French language initially. And it took about 45 minutes to carry out, a lot of tick boxes, and also your freedom to write about your experiences as well. So it was a lot of data. And this went out initially on Evelyn's website, and they were out for about 3 to 4 months at a time. And with that collection of those 3 languages initially, we had over 1,000 respondents. So that was far better than what Dewi Rees had done with his 293 individuals. Certainly hasn't surpassed the postal correspondence of 17,000 individuals with the initial SPR survey, the Census of Hallucinations, but it's certainly the biggest one to date. And now we're also collecting data in Dutch and German languages, and we're also going to progress beyond that. So those are still out collecting data. So there we are out in Evelyn's garden in Geneva, and it just goes to show how long it took to put those kinds of surveys together, specifically looking at these after-death communication experiences. We were there for 3 days solid, just sat around a dining table, question after question, sometimes stopping thinking, now, is that one misleading, or is it too leading, or is it really actually getting to the participant what we want to know from them? And it could be about being touched by the deceased, feeling a touch, sensing a smell, sensing a presence, dreaming about them, seeing them, symbolic experiences. We went through as many different categories as we could and then tried to break them down about different aspects of those experiences as well. So with the blue top on there, that's in the middle, that's Professor Chris Rowe, who I'm sure you've seen before. Initially, when we got the data in, they got processed as quickly as we could. So when we were giving talks, especially when we were giving talks in person, because this was very much pre-COVID, and then we had to navigate the rest of the surveys as COVID took on and all the lockdown procedures, but we managed to get these pamphlets out before we turned to any major peer-reviewed publication. So we still have many of these booklets if you're interested, and they're also available online as well. But we produced one set of booklets that was purely looking at the cases, so it gave many examples of the different types of after-death communication experiences. That's the one in blue. And then over in the green, the research findings, which was an initial breakdown of the statistics of how common or not certain features of the after-death communications were. Our first major publication from this, which is a statistical summary of all the various types of experiences, went to the British Journal of Psychiatry Open. Why there? Well, it was sort of in homage to what William Derry Rees had done. The British Medical Journal is an extremely prestigious journal with a very high impact factor. When we talk about impact factor in academia, it means how strong is it in terms of your paper getting seen and read and then recited in that same year. I think the British Medical Journal is something like impact factor of 28. So you could see 28 other people in formal papers reciting your work. I'm sure it's around there. And at the time, we wanted to go back to the British Medical Journal. We did try, but everything was COVID. So it's not like we picked the wrong time, we were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And we got this funding, so we had to fulfill it. So we thought about where else could we go. We looked at the Lancet in terms of its psychiatry branch and world psychiatry. But we went to the British Journal of Psychiatry and looked at its open journal, so open format, open publishing, anyone can click on it and view it. You don't have to subscribe to the journal. And we went with them. And we had some really, really good reviews from the peer reviewers. You expect when a topic's on parapsychology, you might get some bad reviews. It has happened. Some of that criticism and prejudice is dying down now. The reviewers are really good, and they wanted to hear more cases about the apparitions when we were mainly giving the statistical findings. So we'll potentially go back to that journal to more so give written accounts of these experiences. So that went to the British the British Journal of Psychiatry Open. Has been viewed and recited quite a few times already. But we're working on various other papers. We've had ones in Explore, the Journal of Science and Healing, one in Omega, Journal of Death and Dying. We've had one in a French journal called Evolution Psychiatrique that was led by Renaud Evrard, and a few others besides as well. But we're breaking them down into all these topics. So we will be focusing on the crisis cases, which I'm currently working on. One of our research assistants, Sophie Morrison, is working primarily on messages received. There's specific messages, which we would call veridical messages, where just like in the Julian Burton case, the pale blue dressing gown, and there's specific information there that someone is aware of, but other people aren't, and it needs to be delivered through the experience. Experiences of unknown deceased individuals as well. We have a few of those in our survey feedback. They're not many, but they need singling out and talking about. Indeed, after Harry Price, the famous ghost hunter, passed away, he was reported to have been seen by people in non-English speaking countries where they were experiencing this apparition in their home of this individual, and later found out it appeared to be the ghost of Harry Price. So we're breaking them down to other things. We're looking at the apparitions, the sense of presence phenomena, smells, touch, sound, dream visitations, and various other things. And now we've also got the German and the Dutch data to contend with as well. But those are just a few. We keep joking, and it is somewhat true that we've got 10 years worth of data here to deal with. Some people would say that there's no data on negative experiences. There is, but there are very few. Even from what you saw of Derry Rees's data, it is very few, but there is something to actually explore there. And so one of my dissertation students, Mia, she went and looked at these, and we presented on it at an SPR conference in Newcastle back in 2018. And she interviewed just a select few people that said that their experiences were negative, but still found that after they'd had the experience, they reprocessed it in terms of what it meant to them. And they found it to be quite a positive experience. It's just, again, that person took them by surprise, if seen as an apparition, or they appeared in quite a traumatic state if they died, say, in a car accident, or some sort of illness had made them very withdrawn and skeletal towards the end, and that's also how they were seen in this vision. But later on, people were reprocessing them and seeing them as a good thing. That particular talk is on YouTube for the SPR's YouTube page, so you can look that one up. And I did find it was a month before, and just before, I keep mentioning COVID, but it was a month before COVID struck. Chris French was giving a talk to skeptics in the pub in Nottingham, and I was exactly 1 month after him, talking more or less about this topic. And he mentioned to me, "Oh, have you seen this paper that's come out that's fairly new by Camp et al. That was suggesting that these experiences were negative?" And I hadn't heard of this particular person, so I went and looked at the research. I'm forever trawling for new papers on it, but it was very telling. Camp and colleagues explored 175 elderly individuals between 65 and 81, 4 years post their loss of a loved one. And there we've got a breakdown of some of the ages. Average length of their marriages was 44.3 years. So these people were together for a very long time in the same daily routine and together. Compared to those who did not have after-death communications, they experienced rated as having prolonged grief, post-traumatic stress, depression symptoms, and emotional loneliness, even following their after-death communication. Thus, higher levels of stress and grief seem to be significantly related to the occurrence of having after-death communications. But what was interesting for me, when I looked through that paper and to the reference list, looking at, well, what have they read before? What do they know of the topic? What have they cited? There was no reference to early psychical research. There was no reference to the stuff that Rees had looked into, and there was no reference to the more recent stuff on after-death communications, which again had got a big footing in psychical research and parapsychology, where it had very neat overlaps to positive psychology, and the vast majority of individuals find these to be positive experiences. Writing a paper that was devoid of exploring the literature that shows the positives, it seems that they've gone down the route of finding or believing that these experiences are negative, and yet they've got a very select group that focus primarily on individuals that have been together for a very long time. They've looked at their responses within 4 years post the loss. It seems to be a bit skewed. It's very much a standalone paper where you've got people that are more likely to have a negative reaction to loss because of the duration in which they've been in a relationship, and not allowed them time to actually process more. Well, what did this mean a year after, 2 years after, 3 years after, 5 years after, 10 years after? Or talking to other individuals, access to talking to other individuals that had these experiences. Here, read this book, here, read this literature on these experiences. Or just, you're not alone, going to the GP and saying you're not alone, these experiences are very common, embrace them, which a lot of physicians and scientists have recommended to individuals going through bereavement to embrace these experiences and look at other individuals. You're not alone, and it's not suggestive of some form of psychosis. So here we might have a few papers that might be skewed, and these are the ones that as well that we might see some of the outside skeptic movement, skeptic with a K, picking up and using to quash the benefits of some of these experiences. Whereas an inside skeptic, I'd say, actually, it's important to know the basis of where you're coming from, because it helps you understand the data better, what it means, and where you're going to next. So I'm working on various other things regarding the after-death communications. As I say, I've got PhD students focusing on this. We're in continued bonds in bereavement with Dennis Klass and Edith Stefan. Edith also did her psychology counseling doctorate in this area. I've written chapters. So in that one, I was primarily looking at the after-death communications and what evidence they provide for survival. And here we also have the Routledge International Handbook of Critical Positive Psychology, and they were very much interested in exceptional experiences. So we looked at body experiences and near-death experiences through to the after-death communications as well. So I wrote that with Edith Stefan, David Wild, who's a parapsychologist based at Nottingham Trent University, and then I came in bringing my knowledge of parapsychology and after-death communication. So you're seeing more and more parapsychology literature ending up in very much standard textbooks for thanatology, the study of death, dying, and bereavement, and positive psychology, and other textbooks besides. During the time that we were working on these projects together, Robert Bigelow, who I'm sure you heard of, the aerospace entrepreneur, came forward saying that he wanted to put forward an essay competition, 25,000 words, the best evidence to date that's on record for life after death, permanent bodily death. And so this was the first essay competition of this size. He was offering a grand prize of $500,000, third prize of $300,000, second prize of $300,000 and third prize of $150,000. And as this progressed and people were writing essays as well, they started to make additional awards as well, runners up, and then later on honorable mentions as well. you either got invited to take part, and we did, or you applied to take part. Even if you're invited, you still had to send in information as to who you were and your credentials. But the remit was that if you weren't invited and you wanted to take part, you had to demonstrate at least 6 years involvement in psychical research and parapsychology, or this area of research, and then a few things besides. And I think they had hundreds of essays that came forward, but I think they accepted something like 206 through. And they had a panel of about 6 or 7 judges to go through these essays and discuss which were the best. And so below there, we have the trophies for the judges to thank them. So we've got 6 judges there. And this was a ceremony in Las Vegas at the Aerospace Institute. And those are the top awards up there. So Jeffrey Mishlove, who is the main host of New Thinking Aloud. I'm one of the co-hosts, though I haven't been doing much lately, and I need to. YouTube channel, New Thinking Aloud, Jeffrey won. Pim Van Lommel took 2nd place, discussing near-death experiences. And then one of our fellows of psychology at the University of Northampton, Leah Rugby, who's the editor of the SPR's magazine, he is now working for Robert Bigelow over in Las Vegas. And so his 3rd prize place has certainly taken him places. We got runner-up, so we got $20,000 for our research team of 4, but it took us out to Las Vegas to meet all these various other people. And it was a really interesting experience. It was a very good collaboration exercise. It was really good in the media to show that entrepreneurs such as Robert Bigelow were taking research into life after death so seriously. And to date, I have not seen any backlash or comment in the media or from the skeptic community on this particular prize, which is really surprising in many ways. And they're all open access. You can go to the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies and read any of these essays. They're also coming out in various bound volumes, and he is now already onto the 2nd phase, which is called the challenge, where he's invited people to come forward with empirical study designs to demonstrate life after death. So some people have already been accepted through that, where their studies design seems to be sound. It's been judged by a board of directors, and it's gone through to the next phase, and they're probably collecting data now with some research funding thrown in. So the Bigelow Institute has been very much a good initiative for us in terms of what we're doing with after death communications, and we're still going forward with that. Oh dear, I've moved the org down a little bit, but if you want to know what research we're doing in terms of our team of 4, Evelyn, David, Chris and myself, go to adcrp.org and you can look at all our collective interviews in radio and in person through lectures, and our papers, they've all been gathered on that particular website. There's Chris and I collecting our plaque in Las Vegas. And I was out again the very next year to meet Robert. So Las Vegas is starting to become a very familiar trip for me. And there we go. That's just a summary of what we're doing. That's just one area of interest for us at the University of Northampton. There's my contact details, callum.cooper2@northampton.ac.uk. If you've got questions later on, or you can follow me on Twitter. And with that, I will stop sharing the screen. You might want to take a break for a minute, and then I'll welcome any questions. No, I don't want to do that.
Cal, thank you very much. That's great. I don't know if CJ wants to jump straight in and ask you.